Hey, what is going on, guys? So today we have a huge video and collaboration debunk between me and the Nutrivore on a pro-saturated fat and pro-butter video, which has generated over 2 million views. This video was from a channel called No Lab Coat Required, which has about 80,000 subscribers. So this video of theirs has clearly blown up when you compare their subscriber count to the video's view count. As this debunk video goes on, you are going to become more and more stressed out to know that this video, filled with so many errors, has over 2 million views. And the irony of all of this is that this video is titled "Americans Are Still Tricked by the Biggest Fib in Food History." So this video is meant to be a kind of expose on some big lie or falsehood that Americans have been believing for many decades. But as you'll see by the end of this debunk video, the video we're covering, which is meant to be exposing so many falsehoods and lies, is actually filled with a large amount of errors and falsehoods. And just one final touch of irony. The beginning of this video involves No Lab Coat Required saying, "Welcome to No Lab Coat Required, where I out-research your doctor to learn answers to your questions."
Welcome to No Lab Coat Required, where I out-research your doctor to learn answers to your questions, whether you're confused or just curious.
That's the third level of irony. He claims to out-research your doctor. But what if I told you that No Lab Coat Required's research process is so bad that he actually cites papers that go against what he's claiming? And what if I told you this could be discovered in the literal abstract, or the first page, of the paper he's citing? Yeah, it gets that bad, but don't worry, we will get to the specifics of that later in the video. So there's 3 things I want you to remember while watching this debunk: the amount of views this video has, the title of the video, and the statement, "Welcome to No Lab Coat Required, where I out-research your doctor to learn answers to your questions." Remember these 3 things while also taking into account how many errors this video has. And before we begin, just a little disclaimer: Nutrivore will be covering the first half of the video and I will be covering the second half. Let's begin.
Back to the Time magazine story. This is what the takeaway is. Ancel Keys absolutely rips apart fat. Anything related to fat. Fat edible fat, dietary fat, fat people, anything fat adjacent, all fat, all bad. The low fat movement that ran America into drinking skim milk and staying away from marbled meat, it all started right here. Low fat everything, low fat Bluetooth.
This is just false. Ancel Keys was a proponent of the Mediterranean diet, which is understood to be very liberal with fat, just not saturated fat. This advocacy was born from the results of his 7-country study, which also did not show any statistically significant associations between total fat and mortality after adjustment for saturated fat.
The low fat movement that ran America into drinking skim milk and staying away from marbled meat, it all started right here. Low fat everything, low fat Bluetooth. The story transcribed that cholesterol was the problem. Eat fat, gain cholesterol. Get fat, get heart disease. In that order. That means no more eggs, meat, dairy, or anything fat.
This isn't exactly true. Goal number 2 of the 1977 Dietary Goals for the United States, which can be found on page 32, proposed obesity as a potential moderator variable between total fat and cardiovascular disease. That's not to say that fat causes cardiovascular disease, it's merely to say that the extent to which fat increases body weight will increase cardiovascular disease risk. The rationale was based on dietary trend data over the previous 70 years, which showed an association between dietary fat and obesity. Dietary fat wasn't really blamed for anything in and of itself. It was merely recommended as a lever to pull to reduce total fat in the diet in order to flatten the obesity curve.
Not only were these foods deemed as the problem, but stress, hypertension, smoking, and physical inactivity weren't seen as the problem.
This is just absurd. The 1977 Dietary Goals for the United States literally contains a diagram of a causal model which showcases the relationships between a lot of those variables and heart disease. I can literally show it to you. The only variable that was mentioned by Johnny that wasn't represented in that diagram was stress.
Just going to repeat it for everybody. This video has 2.1 million views.
I kept my opinion out of this video up until this point because here's the kicker. Ancel Keys claims he doesn't know all of the science and mechanisms of cholesterol, but he regards its connection to heart disease as proved. To not fully understand something, but to yet draw a conclusion, that is not science.
This is just fucking stupid. It is not practically possible for us to have that level of epistemic certainty about anything. This was the primary focus of the Debunk thesis, which is foundational to contemporary scientific epistemology. Essentially, the conclusion was that phenomena can never be studied in isolation, and thus you can never have complete or perfect access to causal mechanisms.
Ansel would then go on to start one of the most controversial studies of all time, the 7-country study. United States, Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, Netherlands, Finland, and Japan. Ansel and his team of researchers got busy. They put in some groundwork in all of these countries. We're talking about analyzing blood pressure, ECGs, anthropometric measurements, cholesterol, the whole shebang. Like, the data collection was real. But even more real was his hypothesis. Ansel felt that he had finally collected some legit data to back up what he thought in the first place. And he took it to the streets. Next thing you know, he's on the cover of Time magazine. He gets as celebritized as a dude in a lab coat could get. We're talking Bill Nye the Science Guy, Dexter, Curious George. He had his time to shine, but like I said, as we grew more knowledgeable about the subject, we realized that his study didn't really hold up. In fact, it was torn apart. It was broken down and scrutinized. He was accused of cherry picking certain countries to support his theory. He was accused of measuring the Greek folk during Lent so that he could skew the results. He was accused of not regarding sugar intake, a whole bunch of stuff.
This is also false. This misconception likely comes from international food disappearance data that Keyes presented on for a symposium nearly a decade before he even published on the 7-country study. It's true that Keyes only presented data for 6 countries in his figures despite having access to more data. However, Keyes also explains that this was because the data he had on the other countries was incomplete and not particularly trustworthy. Several years later, another group of authors published data on 22 countries in response to Keyes' paper, but the reliability of the data was questionable. Just to be clear though, none of these data are actually from the 7-country study. The 7-country study had its own data set that did not rely on food availability data or food disappearance data, which actually might have been unreliable at the time due to post-war scarcity. Instead, the 7-country study actually collected its own dietary intake data from individuals who were participating in the study. The 7-country study had access to dietary intake data from both during Lent and not during Lent. As it turns out, we don't really have a good justification for believing that Lent would have affected the data to a large degree because, as you can see here, dietary intakes didn't really change that much during Lent. Keyes and colleagues were not oblivious to this potential source of bias, and they actually took great care to ascertain whether or not religious dietary practices actually produced meaningful differences in average intakes.
We're gonna talk about the real problem here. Are you ready for this? You ready? The problem, what is this? The problem with Ansel Keyes' study was that it was observational. In scientific study, there is a spectrum of quality when it comes to data. The gold standard yielding the highest form of respectable, legitimate data comes from what we call a randomized controlled trial, or RCT. So in an RCT, if we're measuring diet and heart attacks, we're going to separate people into groups. Group 1, we're going to feed them food we think will cause a heart attack. Group 2, we're going to feed them foods we think will not cause a heart attack. And then Group 3, to really balance out the results, we're not going to give them anything. You adjust for variables like age and sex, and boom, you got your results. You can even make that more rigorous by making the participants or even the researchers blind to what they're testing. You can even throw in a placebo effect somewhere. The point is that there is intervention. Observational studies lack that. You go in, make some measurements, observe, then make some more. Observational studies are still legit science, and that's actually how we start things off. We make an observation, we make a guess, and then we test it. But at the very best, observational studies can form a hypothesis. You were taught this in middle school, an educated guess. You can't form a conclusion, let alone tell Time magazine about the results you found in a study where you didn't intervene. You ain't tested none yet.
Why? There's nothing inherently hypothesis generating about so-called observational studies, and there's nothing that inherently bars so-called observational studies from being used for either causal inference or hypothesis testing. While it's true that the presence of an association does not necessarily mean you have the presence of causation, I would like to know if Johnny has a single example of a causal inference in the history of science that wasn't fundamentally based upon an association. Additionally, I'm curious to know whether or not Johnny extends the same criticism to the observational studies that investigate the relationship between smoking and various health outcomes. If so, LOL, If not, what's the difference? What is true of the observational smoking literature that is untrue of the observational diet literature, such that the observational smoking literature can be used for hypothesis testing and causal inference, while the observational diet literature can't? Ultimately, bifurcating health science in general into two broad categories, reliable experimental studies and unreliable so-called observational studies, is just dumb. And it only serves to reveal a profound, clear misunderstanding of what science actually is.
The reason we have low-fat anything in the grocery store to this day is because of this 7 countries observational study.
So Johnny makes the claim that the reason we have low-fat anything in grocery stores is because of the 7 countries study. I'm not even sure where one would have to go to substantiate such a bold claim. Low-fat anything includes things like apples, bananas, oatmeal, rice, pasta. Now, perhaps he means products like this that are reduced fat, but even if these are the products he is meaning to talk about, how exactly is one to establish that these exist because of the 7 countries study? I don't think he realizes the burden of proof he puts on himself when making such a bold claim. This video has 2.1 million views.
Ladies and gentlemen, now for the part you've all been waiting for. It's time for the truth about saturated fat and butter. Meta-analysis on saturated fat. 45 studies analyzed, 347,000 plus participant total. Conclusion? No solid evidence that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of a heart attack.
So this meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies which he cites is often cited in defense of the notion that saturated fat is innocuous and not a nutrient of concern. This is because the total summated findings from the meta-analysis suggested that there was no statistically significant association between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease across a number of cohorts from around the world. However, this isn't even close to the full story. After stratifying the included studies by ranges of intake, we can see a statistically significant 30% increase in risk of cardiovascular disease events when crossing the threshold of 10% of calories. When it comes to calorie intake, passing the 10% threshold of calories from saturated fat is where the dietary guidelines suppose that we should see an increase in risk, and that's precisely what we see.
This was going to be the study that kicked off a montage of me listing a bunch of other studies with similar findings. Bam, case closed. But I had to look a little closer. That study garnered a response from other scientists who believed that the conclusion that they drew was inaccurate because of an overadjustment. An overadjustment can skew the results toward their bias in order to appease their hypothesis. In other words, scientists called them out for cheating the system.
Before tackling this overadjustment criticism that's been given, some things need to be said. It is understood that serum cholesterol serves as a proxy for ApoB, and ApoB is one of the strongest independent risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Serum cholesterol sits in the middle of the causal pathway between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. In many of the included studies, there were adjustments for serum cholesterol, and of course, adjusting for mediating variables tends to render associations non-significant. So yes, overadjustment is a source of potential bias with this paper, but it doesn't appear to be a barrier to us actually finding the association. As discussed a moment ago, when we subgroup analyze their data and test for nonlinearity, the association is clearly seen.
Measuring the effects of saturated fat is inherently difficult. Not only that, but all studies aren't using the same type of saturated fat, and there's levels of quality as well. Every single study I come across hardly ever mentions the quality of the saturated fat. And even less studies directly compare the quality of butter, but I found one, and it's a good one. A controlled, double-blind, randomized intervention study. The researchers weighed up free-roaming cows fed on grass-fed diet against those raised in conventional standards, raised mostly indoors on corn silage, wheat barley silage, and a bunch of other stuff. Just like humans, cows are what they eat. And if we think for 1 second that a stressed out cow fed candy is going to produce the same quality butter as a grass-fed free-roaming cow, then we trip.
Do you remember at the beginning of the video when I said that this guy's research process is so bad that he cites papers that go against what he's actually claiming, and that this can be found in the abstract of the paper he's citing? Well, here is that paper. It's a giant mystery why he's citing this paper to make the case for grass-fed butter. There were no statistically significant differences between the groups for any health measure. However, the authors point out a potential unique LDL raising effect of phytanic acid, which was higher in the grass-fed group compared to conventional butter. So not only are you likely to see no differences in health markers when switching from conventional butter to grass-fed butter, but grass-fed butter with its higher phytanic acid content may even potentiate the hyperlipidemic response to butter itself. You don't even need to read the entire paper to understand this. In case you've forgotten, this video has 2.1 million views.
The study comparing the two groups of cows found major differences in their butter. Conventional butter has an overall higher content of saturated fat than grass-fed butter. Conventional butter has 17% less omega-9 acid, 33% less omega-3 acid, and the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is 45% higher than grass-fed butter. We have to understand that these are two of the same foods, but nutritionally are like night and day.
As discussed earlier, the conclusion literally says that between grass-fed butter and conventional butter, neither are healthier. And this makes sense given how trivial the differences were when it comes to nutritional value in both butters. And in the context of a nutritionally adequate diet, it's unclear how these differences would make any real difference. And whatever benefits the butter has nutritionally, they are very likely outweighed by the LDL raising effect of butter itself.
The advice was to replace butter with unsaturated fats. And trust me, we've done that. Vegetable oil is an umbrella term for all the oils we consume in our foods: soybean oil, sunflower oil, peanut oil, canola oil, and so on. These oils are degraded basically the instant humans touch them. We chemically treat them, which we winterize them, deodorize them, degum them, neutralize them, bleach them. I don't want anything to do with anything that's been through that kind of trauma. We were already given natural fats from the earth, but we developed a system that Frankenstein them. We aren't eating the same butter our great-great-great-grandparents ate, and they sure wouldn't be eating no man-made margarine.
So here we have the usual artificial though, processing though rhetoric where someone just insinuates that if something's processed, it has to be less healthy than something that is natural. But this isn't totally clear and requires an argument.
Fatty acids are special puzzle pieces that the body cannot live without. The brain is 60% fat, and our cell membranes are 50% fat. We need fat to absorb certain vitamins, A, D, E, and K. We need saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and high quality butter provides a vast array of them all. We need FAT.
So here Johnny is claiming that we need saturated fat. I must ask, by what modality is saturated fat necessary? It's not clear if he is claiming that we need saturated fat metabolically or need it nutritionally. The former is true and the latter is false. It's true that saturated fat is synthesized by the body for things like fat storage and cell membrane fluidity, but the mere fact that humans can synthesize saturated fat themselves is a straightforward debunk of the claim that saturated fat is nutritionally needed. Johnny goes on to allude to dietary odd-chain saturated fats being necessary, but I'm not sure where he's getting the necessity claim from. Even if they did have benefits, we need not consume butter or even dairy to achieve those benefits. Certain odd-chain saturated fats can be synthesized de novo from propionate through the fermentation of dietary fiber. When it comes to these nutrients, it's the same idea as before. Yeah, you can get these nutrients from these foods, but you can get these nutrients from other foods which don't come with the same LDL cholesterol raising effect, which is negative. All right, guys, that's the end of the video. Perhaps this is another lesson in how bad misinformation can get on the internet. Again, just the fact that this video had 2.1 million views, has 2.1 million views and is probably going up as we speak, is extremely stressful, and videos like this where we uncover and fact check what people are saying are extremely necessary to get us closer to the truth. And a special thank you to Nutrivore for helping with this collaboration. Definitely go follow him. His link will be in the pinned comment below. If you support my work and want to get early access to it, you can click the link in the pinned comment and support me on Patreon. And if you don't know, I do have a book going over most, if not all, of the anti-vegan arguments you're going to hear online. If you want to get that as well, that'll be linked in the pinned comment. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Dude,
fuck off. I don't want anything to do with you. Don't ever speak to me again. You're a fucking piece of shit.
even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who's your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude,